The chapel was quiet, not out of respect, but out of unease. Charlie Kirk's casket hadn't been lowered yet, and murmurs were already spreading. It was his time. He crossed the line. Don't make this political. Karoline Levitt stood at the back, holding something no one else had touched, the American flag that had rested on his chest. She didn't shed tears. Her jaw was tight, not in mourning, but in anger. She knew what had happened. The same figures who smiled for cameras in Washington had worked behind the scenes to portray Charlie as dangerous, as a propagandist, as extreme. But it wasn't Charlie who smeared others. It wasn't Charlie who labeled veterans as threats. It was them. And now they were sitting in the front row, smiling beneath the very flag he served under. When the pastor invited people to speak, Karoline didn't wait for her name. She walked down the aisle with firm steps, heels striking the polished floor. Her eyes stayed fixed on the political leaders, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Ilhan Omar, Chuck Schumer, and the Republicans who had stayed quiet when it mattered. They sat with heads lowered, as if they hadn't dismissed the values Charlie stood for. At the front. She didn't pull out a written speech or quote scripture. She unfolded the flag and held it up for everyone to see. Her voice was steady and firm as she said one line, "Charlie's blood is on your hands." The room reacted instantly. Some people got up to leave. Others froze. Obama's face hardened. Pelosi looked ready to speak. But Karoline raised a voice before anyone could interrupt. You exploited him. You ridiculed him. You threatened him. And now you hide behind flowers and hymns as if you weren't the ones who set everything in motion. The flag shook slightly in her grip, not from weakness, but from controlled anger. The tension in the room was sharp. Politicians shifted in their seats. Aides whispered. Staffers reached for their phones. Pelosi gestured toward security, but no one acted. Karoline slowly lowered the flag onto the casket. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from anger long contained. She turned to the crowd. You didn't just let this happen. You created the circumstances. You framed it as justice. You called it progress and sold it as unity. Cameras captured everything. Omar leaned toward a staffer. Obama's jaw tightened, the familiar faint smile appearing. But Karoline wasn't there to soften her words. You branded Charlie as a radical because he loved his country. You called him a threat for speaking the truth. Instead of debating him, you tried to silence him. You sent mobs. You censored him. You laughed when he was attacked. She pointed toward Ilhan Omar. You, Congresswoman Omar, labeled him a national danger 2 months ago. You said he was sowing division, when all he did was speak to veterans and read the Constitution. Omar tried to reply, but Karoline silenced her with a simple wave of her hand. No microphone, no gavel, just firm presence. Obama, you convinced the world he was a villain, Karoline said. You went on national television and claimed he divided this nation. But it wasn't him. It was you. You delivered polished speeches that sounded like unity, but underneath, they pushed people further apart. The chapel was completely still. Even the pastor didn't breathe. Karoline's voice dropped lower, controlled and sharp. Charlie didn't divide America. He exposed the fractures you tried to hide. And that terrified you, she paused, letting the silence sink in. So don't come here now with your practiced tears and folded hands. You don't get to mourn the man you spent years trying to tear down. She stepped back for a moment, her expression steady. She wasn't done, not even close. The silence in the room was heavy. Pelosi froze mid-blink. Schumer's hands were clenched on his knees. The choir sat stiff, afraid that even a breath would set something off. Karoline moved forward again, holding up a folded sheet of paper. This, she said, lifting it higher, is Charlie's final note to me. Gasps moved through the room. She unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, her hands tense with emotion that he wrote this the night before he died. And it wasn't about fear or giving up. It was about all of you. She turned to the front row, Obama, Pelosi, Omar, Booker, locking eyes with each of them. "It starts like this," she read, her voice steady. "If they tried to silence me again tomorrow, at least they'll know I wasn't afraid. I know what this is really about. They don't hate me. They hate what I defend." Her hand trembled slightly, but she continued. "They hate the flag. They hate the faith. They hate that I remind people what this country once stood for." The paper snapped as she folded it again. He understood. He knew he'd become a target. Not because he lied, but because he told the truth, Karoline turned toward the mourners in the back. The press will call this a tragedy. They'll say it was random. They'll urge us to come together. No, I'm not interested in a stage show of unity. Tell them why he's gone. She raised her voice. Tell them who made him a target, who mocked him when he was deplatformed, who called him dangerous for praying in public, who sent mobs to his events, who leaked his travel routes, who blocked his protection, who suppressed the evidence he pointed, first at Pelosi, then at Obama, then at Omar. You made sure he would never speak again. But now, you'll hear him through me. She held the letter high. Charlie's blood is on your hands. No headlines, statements. Our spin will wash it away. No1 moved. Cameras stayed fixed. Karoline didn't step back from the podium. She stood there firmly, gripping the letter like a standard. Her breaths came deep and steady. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from sullen to charged. No choir, no whispers, just focused silence. Pelosi shifted, adjusting her seat to regain composure. She opened her mouth to speak, but Karoline cut in before a word came out. Oh, don't you dare, she said sharply. Don't talk about unity now. Her tone struck like a clean edge. You treat this podium like a stage. You treat this funeral like a photo opportunity. She moved beside the pulpit and pointed to the large wreath near the casket. You didn't send that to honor him. You sent it to mask what you did to bury his message. A few people gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. Karoline stepped closer. You celebrated when the news broke. Don't pretend otherwise. He didn't follow your script. He challenged your authority. And to you, that made him expendable. She turned toward the back, where young men wearing mega hats and cross necklaces stood quietly, tears in their eyes. He told them not to live in fear, and you punish him for it. Her voice hardened. You called him extreme for quoting scripture. You called him divisive for loving his country. You said he spread hate for protecting the unborn. And now you stand here in polished suits pretending to grieve, her gaze locked with Obama's. He was louder than you, braver than you, and more committed to this nation than any of you have been in years. The crowd held its breath. You want unity? She asked. Then acknowledge what you did. Admit you smayed him. Admit you cheered when he was silenced. Admit your hands aren't clean. Until then, save your speeches for the cameras. We're not accepting the performance. Karoline turned back to the casket, tucked Charlie's letter beneath the folded flag, and straightened her shoulders. Without raising a weapon, she made her stand clear. She faced the crowd once more, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a stack of printed pages, emails, headlines, screenshots, evidence. She held them up. You didn't just disagree with him, she said. You tried to erase him. So I brought proof. She walked down the aisle, placing each page on the empty pews. Each one carried a name, a false claim, a timestamp. This one, she said, holding up a headline from 3 days after he criticized the FBI, called him violent. There was no violence, only truth. She continued down the row, laying the evidence out one piece at a time. She laid the next sheet in front of a group of suited staffers who wouldn't meet her gaze. And this one, she said, dropping it in front of a CNN employee, you clipped his speech, edited it out of context, and let your panel laugh. He was a human being, not a punchline. She moved toward the front. The White House issued briefings against him. Internal emails labeled him a threat to stability. Do you know what he did that week? He led a prayer vigil for veterans, her voice lowered, not out of hesitation, but from anger restrained. He spoke honestly about fentanyl, border failures, and the erosion of American values. And you painted him as a problem. Because the truth reflected back at you was uncomfortable, the silence was thick enough to catch every sound. Karoline faced a crowd again, her tone rising with clarity. You think because he's not standing here, he's gone? No. He lives on in every young patriot who refuses to stay silent. She placed one final document on the pulpit, a photo of Charlie holding a Bible in one hand and the American flag in the other. The caption read, "They want me silent. That's how I know I should speak louder. You tried to bury him under lies," she said, pointing to the image. But truth doesn't decay. It endures. Karoline now stood not only as his friend, but as a reckoning. She walked toward the front, each step echoing sharply on the marble floor. Every seat was filled, and every eye was fixed on her. The silence wasn't ceremonial. It was tense, uneasy, around the room. Politicians remembered their statements, their hesitation, their clipped comments on television. Karoline was there to hold them to account. "You tell us to say their names," she began. "Fine, I will, but not just the names that suit your narrative. I'll name those who made him wonder." She turned to the first row, fixing her eyes on a senator pretending to scroll his phone. "Senator Jenkins. You called him an extremist for asking why billions were being sent overseas while veterans slept under bridges. Next, she addressed another, Representative Cortez. You mocked his speech about fatherless homes, called it toxic masculinity, and applauded when he was silenced. Then she lifted her finger toward the press section. MSNBC, CNN, The View. You reduced him to a soundbite. You twisted his faith, his words, his patriotism. You turned him into a caricature and then acted surprised when he stopped laughing. Reporters shifted uncomfortably. One lowered their camera, another reached for water. No one knew who she would call out next. You asked why he wasn't softer, why he didn't speak gently, she continued, her voice cracking but not breaking. He did, until you dismissed every plea for reason. And then you wondered why he raised his voice. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. We warned you, all of us did, that pushing people to the edge doesn't silence them. It hardens them. It turns mourners into fighters. And here I am, saying the names. Starting with yours. Karoline walked back to the casket, gently pulled back a corner of the flag, and laid a slip of paper on Charlie's chest. It read, "They know now. Rest." She didn't leave the podium yet. Behind her, the stained-glass windows filtered sunlight into sharp patterns that cut through the air. She stood in that light, steady and unwavering. You wrapped yourselves in activism, she said, scanning lawmakers, pundits, and clergy. But when Charlie wrapped himself in this flag, you called it cosplay. You called it dangerous. She reached under the pulpit and pulled out Charlie's folded flag, the same one he had carried after Veterans for Truth rally that was met with threats and media ridicule. She held it high that he carried this flag on his back while walking through homeless encampments in Los Angeles. She said, "You carried cameras to the border for photo ops." Her hand shook slightly, not from weakness, but from holding back emotion. Charlie wasn't flawless. He never claimed to be. But he showed up. When fentanyl claimed another life, he was there. When churches were attacked, he went. When a veteran's grave was defaced, he cleaned it himself. She looked at the politicians. Where were you? No one answered. You tweeted. He delivered supplies. You held signs. He held hands. You posed. He prayed. Her gaze sharpened. And now, you want to rewrite the story. You want to call him divisive while you spent years dividing this country for book deals and online applause. She folded the flag carefully and placed it at the casket's foot. Then she raised her head. This flag doesn't belong to politicians who hide behind it. It belongs to those who bled beneath it. Charlie didn't die from hate. He died because he told the truth, and you couldn't handle it. A camera clicked. Another shut off. Still, no one moved. Karoline's footsteps echoed as she approached the front row. Senators, reporters, and public figures sat stiffly, their composed faces cracking under the weight of the moment. She pointed to an empty chair. "That's your seat, Congresswoman Waters," she said calmly. "Right there." While he was labeled a threat on your network. Representative Maxim shifted uneasily, but Karoline's tone stayed firm. You had the platform. You had the microphone. You had the spotlight. And when it mattered, you said nothing. When lies were thrown at him, you stayed silent. Let the critics rage while you turned your backs. Her hand moved toward the second row. You too, Senator Schumer. Don't look away. You stood by while your party branded him a danger to democracy. Her voice sharpened. But tell me, what's truly more dangerous? A young man carrying a Bible, or a chamber full of leaders too afraid to defend someone they disagree with? A wave of silence swept through the room. Karoline's gaze landed on Anderson Cooper near the press section. You cut his clips to fit your story, she said evenly. You edited his words to feed a narrative. And even when you learned he was receiving death threats, you ran the same segment again. Smiling, her voice cracked for just a second. I begged you off camera. I pleaded with you to stop. I emailed every network. I showed you the threats, the doxing, the list with his name on them. But your producer said it would cool off. She steadied herself. You called it backlash. I call it blood. Karoline stepped back. Though her frame was slight, her presence filled the space. You'll paint him as a villain now. That's what always happens when someone inconvenient dies. You'll reshape his story into a warning about extremism. You'll bring in commentators to dissect a man you never bothered to know. You'll let pundits mock him at his own funeral while pretending to mourn. She leaned forward, voice lowered to a near whisper, but it carried through the chapel. You stayed silent. You chose silence. Karoline walked to the casket and placed a torn newspaper clipping on top, the one that had falsely labeled him a domestic extremist. She struck a match and let the edges burn into ash. Then she faced the cameras. Her tone no longer for those in the pews but for the entire nation. Silence doesn't shield you. It reveals you. No1 moved. Even the lighting seemed to dim, as if the room itself understood the weight of the moment. Karoline didn't turn around. Behind her, news anchors whispered hurriedly, already shaping their post-funeral coverage. You could see it in their shifting eyes and quick typing. Headlines forming. Karoline Levitt politicizes funeral, or a mega display at the pulpit. She saw it too, but didn't care. From her coat pocket, she pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. This, she said, lifting it high, was Charlie's final message to a friend. He sent it the night before he died. The room fell still. She read aloud. They don't hate me because I lie. They hate me because I won't. Gasps echoed through the cathedral. Karoline turned to face the political figures seated together. Pelosi, Schiff, Booker, and Obama among them. You didn't just attack a man, she said clearly. You used his body to advance your narrative. You waited until he was gone to call him every name you could think of, because you knew he couldn't respond. She fixed her gaze on Obama. You said he divided this country. No. He revealed the divisions already there. Obama stiffened, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. Cameras zoomed in, catching the tension in his jaw. Karoline turned down the aisle, her boots hitting the floor with a steady rhythm. Each step like a beat of truth. Don't call him a teachable moment. Don't turn him into a case study on polarization. Don't shrink his life into your talking points. Her voice rose, strong and unscripted. His name was Charlie Kirk. He wasn't a symbol. He wasn't a meme. He was a man who loved God, loved his country, and dared to challenge a powerful system that tried to silence him. She faced the altar where a polished portrait of Charlie stood, surrounded by flowers and quiet. Say his name, she said. Say it without hesitation. Her eyes shifted to the media row. Say it without twisting it. Then she turned back to the audience. You don't get to bury a man's legacy just because you didn't like his tone. He looked uneasy, but Karoline stepped aside, handing him the MIC, not as a sign of respect, but as a challenge. You can finish the prayer, she said evenly. But I already gave the sermon. She walked away with steady resolve, eyes burning but dry. Behind her, the silence wasn't sorrowful anymore. It carried weight. Outside the cathedral, her heels struck the stone steps as wind caught the edge of her coat. The crowd waiting beyond the doors hadn't gathered for ceremony. They wanted something genuine, and she had given them exactly that. Reporters swarmed her like hawks, some scrambling to frame their stories, others momentarily lost for words. Karoline. One called out, "Do you regret confronting the former president during a funeral?" She paused. Her eyes held steady. In her hand was Charlie's final note, edges damp from her grip. Regret? She repeated, her voice cutting through the chaos. Are you asking if I regret standing between the truth and those who twisted at the moment he died? She stared directly into the nearest camera. Let's make this clear. If silence is expected when they slander the dead, then I'll be the exception. The crowd quieted. Charlie Kirk didn't ask to be a saint, she continued. He asked for honesty. And when he passed, the same people who called him a danger to democracy tried to seize control of his memory. She pointed back toward the church, and Barack Obama, yes, I'm saying his name, had the nerve to call Charlie divisive while standing behind a pulpit built on polished narratives, and media applause. Gasps rippled through the courtyard. Karoline leaned toward the reporter's microphone, now shaking slightly. Here's the truth. Charlie didn't divide anything. He showed the divisions that already existed, between elites who celebrate each other in cathedrals and ordinary Americans labeled as extremists for loving their country. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, warm Bible. This was Charlie's, she said, lifting it high. You want a legacy? It's not found in statues or blue check marks. It's in the backbone of a generation that refuses to kneel. She turned to cameras one last time. If you're still silent after everything, then you're part of the problem. The silence that followed was immense. No stage tears, no carefully worded tributes. Just the echo of one voice that wouldn't stay quiet. Karoline stepped toward the crowd, not away, but into them. Into the people Charlie had stood up for. Into the movement he refused to abandon. And behind her, for the first time that day, someone whispered his name softly, like a vowed Charlie. They had tried to bury his words under headlines. They had tried to erase his name with silence. But that night, Charlie Kirk wasn't ignored. He was defended, not by politicians, not by the press, but by someone who refused to waver. Karoline Leavitt hadn't come to play politics. She came to expose every lie, every coward hiding behind flowers and polite smiles, and she did it not with a speech, but with his Bible in her hands. This wasn't only about one man. It was about a generation branded dangerous for daring to speak, believe, and stand firm that if his blood is on their hands, then his legacy rests in ours. And as long as there's breath in our lungs, we'll speak his name louder than they ever dared to whisper it. Charlie Kirk, friend, fighter, a flame they couldn't put out, rests loud.